Good people, today let's talk about my experience with this insane 360Hz display from ASUS, the PG259QNR. I feel like this is a really interesting look into the future of competitive gaming space because this monitor has a built-in NVIDIA Reflex latency analyzer that can measure full system latency from the mouse click to that action being displayed on the screen. So you don't require that LDAT module. Everything's kind of built into the one package, and that is awesome. I really want to take this opportunity and test how different in-game settings affect system latency and what we can do to reduce it. For example, how does resolution, in-game settings, the visual quality settings, and HDR all play a role in either increasing or reducing system latency. Should be fun. Basically, measuring latency can give us a measure of system responsiveness, so how snappy are your mouse clicks and your motion instead of just your raw frame rate. And I do think system latency will become a bigger part in the conversation of like gaming benchmarks, especially for esports games. I'll test this in many of the popular games that support NVIDIA Reflex low latency mode and digest it for us all to understand why it's going to be, very important for some people. Although after all the testing, I have my reservations on how useful it can actually be for people, but I'll also talk about my experience with this 360Hz display and how it has a much larger role to play aside from being the fastest screen on the market right now. Ooh, a 30mm frame, so it's a little thicker, ideal for multiple locations, but is the performance mind-blowing? Exactly. Introducing the new T30 fans from Fantex, the ultimate fan for radiators, heatsinks, and cases where you need powerful airflow with an excellent sound profile. The 3 RPM mode switch is a clever integration, you gotta appreciate daisy chain potential, and of course, a good looking fan will keep the system clean. Check out the T30 fan down below. So the very first thing I did when I got this monitor is actually install that awesome ROG desk mounting kit because the default stand is a little too wide, it flares out too much where I hit it with my mouse on my very tiny gaming desk. And the second thing, I'm not a RGB savage after all, is disable the RGB cycle for the back of the monitor for the logo and just set a beautiful static color of my choice. And this is also a perfect opportunity for an additional flex where I use the Gundam Edition RTX 3080. My gosh, what a beautiful GPU to make sure that I am hitting all the right frame rates to be used with this 360Hz display. Can we just take a moment to look at this graphics card? I love the design and all the little tiny elements that are associated with Gundam Edition throughout this entire cooler. It's an awesome looking card. I appreciate my privilege. Now the screen is 24.5 inches with Full HD resolution, a single DP and HDMI ports, plus this USB input where you plug in the mouse. It's nicely color coded in red. The screen is a dual driver IPS panel with 360Hz refresh rate and 1 millisecond gray-to-gray response time with surprisingly good looking colors out of the box. It has HDR support, G-Sync of course, and that spicy built-in feature to measure system latency, which you can see comprises of many elements starting from the input device, passing through the hardware, and finally appearing on the display. What's really interesting is that we can measure that entire pipeline using this monitor. It's a pretty straightforward process. You plug the mouse into a USB port on the monitor that's just for pass-through, and ASUS confirms that it does not introduce any latency into testing. Then while in-game we require some repetition, like bright muzzle flashes or a spell going off inside this user-defined box on the screen, and of course a supported mouse like this Chakram Core, and in the end, we get a report that shows our own system latency per click. So that's really cool, right? But why? So this is the question that me and the guys have been asking for a while, and the answer has two parts to it. So for number one, the main one is to figure out what hardware to use, what in-game settings to use, what mice to use to get the best, lowest possible latency. I can see this being applied in esports 100%, where you can like fine-tune systems to make sure that both teams are technically equal in terms of latency and performance. I can also see gaming companies using this for marketing purposes to like sell us gaming mice that have lower click latency than competition. That is definitely coming soon. Or in videos like this where I can tell you that enabling HDR in Destiny 2 has no effect on system latency, at least not a significant one, nor do any of the visual settings between low and highest have an impact on system latency, which is very nice to see, and is a pretty interesting interesting surprise, but results definitely will vary from one game to another. For example, in Overwatch, you can see the difference between the epic and low visual presets and how it affects latency, so slightly more significant versus Destiny 2, which is also kind of cool to see. And basically, you can now game with higher graphic settings without significantly affecting your latency when you enable Reflex toggle in-game. And the second part of that why question is to start discussion about latency on a more technical level and use tools at our disposal to measure how the Reflex low latency modes in supported games actually impact latency and if it has any solid ground on what NVIDIA is trying to market as well. So for games like Escape from Tarkov, Apex Legends, Overwatch, COD, Valorant, etc. has the Reflex toggle in the settings that aims to improve system latency. Fortnite is another example enlisted and some other free-to-play titles. So definitely there is a focus on multiplayer, almost free-to-play games that are widely available where you can actually find the Reflex toggle. So after my measurements are complete, you can see it does in fact reduce system latency across the board, even at 360 Hz, despite being a very small reduction with the RTX 3080. Now both Mike and Eber asked me if I could tell the difference between Reflex on and off in games like Valorant, where my frame rates are insanely high already with the RTX 3080 and the 360 Hz display. And I honestly could not tell the difference between on and off, even though there's a slight technical improvement in system latency. But when we lower the refresh rate to 60 Hz, you can see system latency gets lower as we increase the refresh rate, and that should be the main selling point for competitive gamers. Plus, in games like EFT, enabling Reflex allows the game to go beyond 144 FPS, which is appreciated, but I don't understand why it's a toggle and it's not something that is enabled by default like it is in Destiny 2 when it sees that you have the right drivers and you have a compatible GPU. So it's one of those things where you can enable it and see that it does improve system latency, which is definitely more noticeable on lower end systems. Where the GPU, for example, might be struggling and your settings are maybe maxed out for the best visuals, and that's exactly what we see here with the weaker RTX 2060, as system latency across these games with Reflex enabled is significantly more reduced in terms of percentages versus what we saw with the RTX 3080. In reality, however, all these titles are the multiplayer, highly competitive games where, I mean, who plays Fortnite with maxed out RTX graphics anyway, right? So you lower everything to give you the maximum FPS, and therefore Reflex low latency mode in those games, it does have a benefit, but it has diminishing returns as you have better hardware. And so it's interesting to see technologies that are built into here to analyze your latency are targeted towards the really competitive crowd with the best hardware and manages to drive the best FPS possible, while the Reflex low latency toggle in games is targeting exactly the opposite, or at least that's where you see the biggest benefit in reducing the latency when you're dealing with, you know, low end to mid-range hardware. All right, so about my actual experience with 360 Hz. How is it, right? It's the fastest refresh rate screen that I've ever played with. It has gotten me into more competitive mindset of like lowering my resolution, lowering my settings to get those frame rates above 360 or like at least match the 360, but anything above 200 FPS anyway with G-Sync enabled is super smooth and clear. But as the data shows, using a high refresh rate does lower your system latency overall. Even though it's a very small amount, there's still a slight technical benefit. So if you are all about experimentation, the built-in latency analyzer is a great conversation starter, and for you to also dive in deeper and like understand what hardware in terms of pieces of hardware in your PC and what mouse you're using does to your latency in whatever game you play at whatever settings. So there's a lot of experimentation in there, and if you want to dive in deeper, this is a cool way to go. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think of the topic. If you've tried the Reflex toggle in some of the games, what your experience has been like, share in the comments below. I'm Dmitry. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you in the next video. And as always, rubber band responsibly, my friends. That was not a dirty joke. It's a netcode joke. All right, I'll let myself out.